We like to think we're in control of our lives, of our choices, of our future. From the moment we open our eyes each morning, we move through life with a quiet assumption that we're steering the wheel, that we're making things happen, that our plans, our routines, our goals are all within our grasp, waiting to be shaped by our will. And in that illusion, we find comfort, because the idea of control feels safe, predictable, empowering. But what if that sense of control is not real? What if it's just a story we tell ourselves to avoid confronting a more uncomfortable truth? The Buddha taught that clinging to control is one of the deepest forms of suffering. Because when we believe we must always be in charge, we start to resist the flow of life. We tighten, we grasp, we obsess. We try to control people's opinions of us. We try to control outcomes we cannot predict. We even try to control time itself, planning every hour, chasing every milestone, fearing every wrinkle. But life doesn't bend to our will. It moves like a river, flowing, shifting, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce, and we are not its masters. We are only visitors. And here lies the paradox. The more we try to control, the more fragile we feel. The tighter we hold on, the more things slip through our fingers. This isn't just spiritual poetry, it's something you've likely felt. Remember a moment when life didn't go according to plan. A relationship you thought would last but didn't. A job you counted on but lost. A dream you built your world around, only to watch it crumble. In those moments, we are confronted with a truth we don't like to admit. That control is not certainty. It's merely the illusion of safety. A house of cards built on shifting sand. But here, that's what Buddhism reveals. This realization isn't meant to depress us. It's meant to wake us up. Because once we see the illusion clearly, we are free to stop chasing it. And in that space, a new kind of peace can emerge. Not the peace of control, but the peace of acceptance, of presence, of understanding what is rather than what should be. So many of us spend our entire lives trying to make the world conform to our desires. But suffering arises when the world doesn't obey. Buddhism calls this dukkha, the dissatisfaction that comes when we resist the impermanent, unpredictable, imperfect nature of life. Yet when we surrender this resistance, not in weakness but in wisdom, we begin to align with the rhythm of reality. We begin to let go. And letting go is not giving up. Letting go is letting be. It's choosing to soften our grip. To stop demanding perfection from a world that was never meant to be perfect. To stop forcing outcomes and start flowing with life. Just imagine the freedom that comes when you no longer need to control everything. When your mind no longer spins trying to fix, manage, or manipulate every moment. When you simply show up awake, aware, and open, ready to meet life as it is, not as you wish it to be. This is the beginning of the path. This is where true wisdom begins, not with more control, but with honest surrender. And in this surrender, we don't become passive. We become more alive, more responsive, more in tune with the ever-changing miracle of existence. We start to recognize that we don't need to hold the steering wheel so tightly. Because life, when met with awareness, becomes its own kind of unfolding perfection. Not in the outcomes, but in the presence we bring to each moment. So ask yourself right now, what are you trying to control? And what would it feel like to let it go just for today, not as a loss, but as an offering, as an act of wisdom? Because when we release the illusion of control, we don't fall apart. We fall into life. And maybe, just maybe, that's where true peace begins. From this foundation, from this recognition. We've spent so much of our lives trying to hold on, trying to shape life into something we can manage, predict, and bend to our liking. But what if peace doesn't come from holding tighter? What if it comes from releasing our grip entirely? There's a strange paradox in life. The more we chase control, the more chaos seems to follow. And yet, when we begin to release, truly release, something extraordinary begins to happen. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you just sat, without planning, without analyzing, without needing to fix or improve anything, and simply allowed the moment to be enough? In Buddhist teachings, there is a beautiful word, awaken, equanimity. It's not indifference. It's not apathy. It's the deep, still water at the center of a storm. The unshakable peace of a mind that no longer needs life to go one way or the other. And that stillness, it's already within you. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not from what happens to us, but from how tightly we cling to how we think things should be. Control is our attempt to argue with reality, and reality always wins. But surrender. Surrender is not weakness. It's trust. It's wisdom. It's choosing to soften when the world hardens around you. It's allowing things to unfold without needing to dominate the outcome. It's watching the river flow and finally realizing you don't have to swim upstream anymore. Think about this. The tree that stands stiff in a storm is often the one that breaks, but the bamboo that bends with the wind, it survives, it thrives. It knows the secret of letting go. We often fear letting go because we think it means losing our identity, our goals, our direction. But in truth, letting go is an opening, a door swinging wide to the present moment. And in that present moment lives everything we were searching for through control. Security, clarity, and most of all, peace. The peace of not needing to know what comes next. The peace of realizing you're already home, even when the path feels uncertain. One Zen master was once asked, "How do you remain so calm in the face of uncertainty?" He smiled gently and replied, "I simply stopped needing things to be any different than they are." Can you imagine that kind of peace? Waking up and realizing you don't need to micromanage life anymore. You don't need every answer, every plan, every backup plan. You just need to be, and to trust. That doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You still act, but your actions come from clarity, not fear. You still dream, but you aren't shattered when things shift. You still love, but you understand love isn't about possession. It's about presence. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means giving in to what is. And when you give in with grace, you don't lose control. You transcend the need for it, because in that letting go, you begin to hear something deeper, a silence beneath the noise, a stillness beyond the storm, a truth that whispers, you are not here to force life, you are here to live it. And when you let go, truly let go, you fall into that stillness, and that stillness, it catches you, it carries you, not forward, not backward, but inward to where you've always belonged. Now that we've released the illusion of control and begun to taste the peace of surrender, a new doorway begins to open. A doorway that doesn't lead to more doing, but to a deeper being. In the next unfolding, we'll walk through that threshold and explore the wisdom of seeing life exactly as it is. Without distortion, without resistance, just truth, just clarity, just this, shall we step through. We begin with the warmest of intentions. We care, we love. We want the best for the people around us, our children, our parents, our partners, even our closest friends. And so we give our time, our energy, our attention, our hearts. But at what point does this beautiful offering begin to take a different shape? You see, love, when it flows freely, is liberating. But when it tightens its grip, it begins to chain. And what once was care becomes control. What once was presence becomes expectation. And what once was love slowly morphs into attachment. That transformation happens subtly. It doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It seeps in like fog, slowly blurring the clear edges of our intentions. You start by checking in on your child's well-being. And before you realize, you're planning their future, micromanaging their choices, fearing every mistake they might make. Not out of malice, no, but out of love misdirected. You want to help your aging parent, and then in your mind their suffering becomes your suffering. You stop living your life because theirs is full of pain. You think it's empathy, but often it's entanglement. This is the burden of care, when love becomes a source of suffering, when it no longer uplifts but depletes. The Buddha saw this clearly. He taught that all suffering begins with tanha, with craving. And what is attachment if not craving disguised as love? We crave for others to be happy. We crave for them to be safe, to be well, to be successful. We crave for their lives to go a certain way. But that craving, even if wrapped in the language of love, is still craving. And where there is craving, there is clinging. And where there is clinging, there is suffering. Let me share a small story. Perhaps it mirrors something in your own life. A mother watches her adult son move across the country. She smiles and says she's proud. But inside, she's torn. She worries. She calls every day. She asks too many questions. Not because she doesn't trust him, but because she can't let go. She clings. She suffers. In her mind, she believes her love means holding on. But in truth, love, real love, means letting go. When we confuse love with attachment, we unknowingly build our own prison. We think we're being selfless, but we're not. We're just terrified to feel powerless, to watch those we love make mistakes, to accept that they have their own path, one we can't walk for them. And yet, that's the great paradox. True care begins when we relinquish our need to control, when we understand that love is not about directing another's life, but about being fully present for it, without needing to fix or shape it. This doesn't mean we stop helping. It doesn't mean we become cold or detached. No, not at all. It means we learn to care. Without carrying, to love. Without clinging, to be fully here. Without needing others to be different. When we drop the burden of care, we're not abandoning love. We're allowing it to breathe, to soften, to expand. We free others, and in doing so, we free ourselves. And as we begin to unburden ourselves from the weight of attachment, something curious begins to happen. In the quiet space left behind, we may finally hear the whisper of a deeper truth, one that's been there all along, waiting patiently behind the noise. Let's follow that whisper, as we now explore a truth often feared, often misunderstood, yet holding a key to our deepest peace. Ready? There comes a moment in life when words no longer suffice, when every explanation, every justification, and even every tear feels empty, not because they aren't sincere, but because they only stir more turbulence in a sea already too restless. It's in that moment you begin to sense the hidden power of silence, not as avoidance, but as a profound inner posture, equanimity. Emotional equanimity is not apathy. It is not the shutting down of your heart, nor is it numbness masquerading as strength. It is the steady presence of mind that arises when you finally stop chasing after the illusion that every emotion must be expressed, solved, or understood. It is the courage to feel fully, without being drowned by the feeling. Many people believe that being emotional is being alive. But Buddhism teaches a different wisdom, that true aliveness comes not from reacting to every high and low, but from being still enough to witness them all without becoming them. Like a calm monk sitting in the eye of a storm, equanimity is your sanctuary. You see, anger is loud, sadness echoes, fear runs in circles, but peace, true peace, whispers. And you can only hear it when you stop trying to speak over it. This is the strength in silence. In the Zen tradition, silence is more than golden, it is sacred. It is the voice of truth. A Zen master once said, "When you speak, you only repeat what you already know, but in silence, everything can be known." Think about that. Every time you lash out in anger, you are just echoing your past pain. Every time you over-explain yourself, You are often trying to soothe your own uncertainty more than clarify anything for others. But when you remain still, not cold but calm, you invite the world to reveal itself. There is an ancient story of a monk who was falsely accused of a terrible crime. Instead of defending himself, he simply replied, "Is that so?" His silence was not weakness, it was power. The kind of power that comes from deep inner clarity. In time, the truth came out, and the monk remained undisturbed. That's equanimity. But how do we cultivate such stillness in a world that constantly pushes our buttons? It begins with awareness, not judgment of your emotions. Instead of saying, "I'm angry," try, "Anger is here." Notice the difference. The first makes you the emotion. The second allows you to observe it. It creates space. And in that space, wisdom grows. Then return to the breath. The breath is the anchor. Inhaling deeply, exhaling slowly, you remind your body and mind that nothing needs to be fixed right now. You are already safe, already whole. Equanimity is not built overnight. It's forged in daily life, in traffic jams, in arguments, in disappointments. You don't wait for peace to arrive. You bring it with you, like a candle into a dark room. And yes, people may misunderstand your calm. They may mistake it for indifference. But that's okay, because you no longer need to be understood to be at peace. You no longer seek validation in the chaos of others. You found your center. There is a certain elegance in choosing silence when you could explode. There is a quiet power in walking away from drama, not because you're weak, but because you've outgrown the need to prove yourself. And this doesn't mean suppressing emotion, it means maturing beyond it. The mature soul doesn't deny pain, it simply refuses to let pain dictate behavior. There's a line in the Dhammapada. As a rock is not shaken by the wind, the wise are not moved by praise or blame. That's equanimity, to remain unmoved in the face of life's storms, because your peace is no longer negotiable. This kind of silence isn't empty. It's full of presence, full of knowing, full of the vast sky that lets every cloud pass without clinging. And here's the truth, the more you practice this inner silence, the more deeply you'll hear life. Not just its noise, but its subtle rhythms. They say fear is a shadow, not a substance. But to the heart that clings, fear feels like a storm, loud, real, and impossible to ignore. We fear loss. We fear change. We fear the unknown. And in that fear, we grasp, desperately trying to hold on to people, identities, and outcomes as if our survival depends on it. But what if the very act of clinging is what's keeping us trapped? In the quiet teachings of the Buddha, there's a radical proposition. To let go is not to lose, but to trust. To surrender is not weakness, but the highest form of courage. And to release our grasp on certainty is to find a peace that can never be stolen. Letting go begins not with abandonment, but with understanding. It's not about renouncing the world and becoming numb. It's about seeing clearly that everything we hold, our youth, our relationships, our roles, even our breath, is impermanent. Nothing belongs to us and nothing ever did. The illusion of ownership breeds anxiety, but in truth, there is nothing to lose, because there was never anything to keep. Aging often brings this lesson to the surface. As the body softens, as roles shift, and people we love depart this life, the ego recoils in fear. What will become of me? It asks. But perhaps the deeper question is, what if you were never that me to begin with? Fear only exists when there's something to defend. But when we let go of that self-made fortress, our image, our pride, our control, what remains is spaciousness. And in that space, trust is born. Trust in what? Trust in life as it is. Trust that we are held even when we can't see the hands. Trust that every falling leaf, every goodbye, every ending is not a failure, but a flow. The river doesn't argue with the rocks, it moves around them. The tree doesn't panic when autumn comes, it sheds its leaves, knowing spring will follow. In Buddhism, this trust is called saddha. Not blind belief, but a deep inner confidence, a knowing that even suffering can be a teacher and even emptiness can be full. When we cultivate this faith, we stop resisting the moment, and in doing so, we begin to live. Freedom from fear doesn't come from controlling more, it comes from surrendering more. It's not the bravado of saying, "I'm not afraid." It's the gentler wisdom of whispering, "Even if I'm afraid, I will trust." Many elders, after lifetimes of striving, discover this truth late. But it's never too late. A woman once said, "When I stopped needing my children to be happy, they found happiness on their own." A man reflected, "When I let go of proving my worth, I finally felt worthy." These moments of surrender are not endings, they are openings. Letting go is not a passive act. It's the active, conscious decision to not be ruled by fear. It's choosing stillness over struggle, presence over projection. And each time we release another layer of resistance, we taste a bit more freedom. The peace of letting go is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. But you'll feel it in the softening of your chest, the quieting of your thoughts, the gentle return to breath. It is subtle, but it is sacred. And it begins with trust. Now, as we settle deeper into this unfolding journey, we come upon a subtle truth, one often overlooked yet profoundly transformative. Because sometimes it's not fear that binds us, but love. Not love in its purest form, but the kind of love that slowly hardens into attachment. Let us explore. We spend so much of our lives reaching, grasping for some invisible missing piece. A better job, a better partner, a better body, a better version of ourselves. The chase is exhausting, isn't it? As if happiness is a destination just beyond the next achievement. But the truth, the one we often avoid, is this: there's nothing missing. From a Buddhist perspective, this craving for completion is dukkha, the subtle dissatisfaction that haunts the human condition. It whispers, "You're not enough yet, keep going." And so we obey, dragging ourselves through years of striving, unknowingly reinforcing the illusion that something is broken within us. But what if we paused? What if we stopped seeking and started seeing, not with the eyes of lack, but with the eyes of presence? There is a Zen saying, "You are the sky, everything else it's just the weather." Meaning your true self is vast, unshakable, inherently whole. The thoughts, emotions, and external circumstances, they come and go like clouds, storms, and sunshine. But the sky remains. The Buddha didn't teach that we must become someone else. He taught that we must awaken to what's already here. The self we are constantly trying to improve is, in many ways, just a bundle of thoughts and preferences, not the true self, but the constructed self. So what happens when you stop constructing? What emerges when the noise of not enough fades? Stillness, contentment, wholeness. Not the kind of wholeness that comes from achievement, but the kind that comes from acceptance. The kind that is not earned but remembered. Remember this: even your flaws are part of your perfection. Even your wounds are part of your wholeness. Like a cracked bowl that still holds water, you are functional, beautiful, and complete, not despite your imperfections but because of them. In Japanese Zen, there's the art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold. The cracks are not hidden but highlighted. What was once broken is now even more valuable. Can you see your life this way? Not as a collection of failures to be hidden, but as a golden trail of resilience. The spiritual path isn't about becoming something more. It's about recognizing that you've always been enough. Every breath, every scar, every heartbreak, every act of compassion, they've all been carving out the wisdom you now carry. The Dalai Lama once said, "The purpose of our lives is to be happy." But true happiness, he clarifies, doesn't come from consumption, it comes from clarity. And clarity reveals this one simple, radiant truth: you are already whole. So let the chasing end. Let the grasping soften. Let your worth be non-negotiable. Let your inner silence speak the loudest. And in that stillness, recognize yourself not as a project to be fixed, but as a presence to be embraced. Because you were never lacking. You only forgot. And now you remember. Shall we continue this unfolding? Have you ever said yes when your whole being whispered, "Please just say no"? We all have. Not because we truly agreed, but because we were afraid. Afraid of disappointing, of appearing selfish, of being left behind or unloved. But here's the hidden cost. Every time you betray your own boundaries to please someone else, a small part of your peace gets chipped away. Buddhist wisdom doesn't teach us to be agreeable, it teaches us to be truthful. And truth often begins with a firm, clear, loving no. You see, the word no is not rejection, it's recognition. It's a recognition of your energy, your time, your values. It's an acknowledgement that while compassion extends outward, it must also include yourself. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha reminds us, if one holds oneself dear, one should guard oneself well. He didn't say, give everything to everyone. He said, guard. That's a boundary. For the elderly, especially those raised to believe that saying no is unkind. This lesson arrives late, but it arrives with deep freedom. You've lived a life giving so much to others, your children, your partner, your friends, your workplace, your community. But how often have you given yourself the space to just breathe? To say, no, I can't make that phone call today. No, I won't attend that gathering if it leaves me drained. No, I won't entertain this guilt anymore. Because here's the truth, saying no is not closing the door on love. It's opening the door to inner alignment. Boundaries are not walls, they're sacred gates. They don't keep people out, they help you stay in tune, in peace, in presence. A Zen monk once said, when you draw a circle around your peace, only those who honor it may enter. That circle is your sacred no. Not to punish others, but to honor the temple of your being. And for those who truly care for you, they won't resent your boundary. They'll respect it, because they'll finally see not just the version of you that gives endlessly, but the version that lives authentically. So the next time someone asks something of you, pause, not from fear, not from anger, but from deep clarity. Ask yourself, is this a yes from my soul or a yes from my wounds? Because the most loving response you can offer this world is your truth. And sometimes truth speaks softly but firmly, no. When you begin honoring that sacred word, you'll notice something unexpected. Not only do you feel lighter, you start attracting people, situations, and energies that respect your light. Saying no clears space, and from that space, stillness arises, joy returns, life flows again. And as we flow forward on this path of simplicity and clarity, we arrive at a deeper realization. That fear, the kind that whispers you'll be unloved, alone, or left behind if you set boundaries, was never real. What's real is what comes next. Let's step into that deeper truth together. We grow up under a silent spell, the spell of someday. Someday I'll be free. Someday I'll be happy. Someday, when the kids grow up, when the debts are paid, when the house is clean, when the body is healed, when the world is quiet, then I'll finally sit down and breathe. Then I'll rest. Then I'll live. But that someday never comes. It's a horizon that moves further every time we take a step. And yet we keep chasing it. Because deep inside, we believe there's a better moment waiting, more perfect, more peaceful, more worthy than the one we're in now. This is the great illusion of time. It fools us into believing that life is always almost here. That the real beginning, the true living, is still somewhere in the distance. So we delay joy. We postpone presence. We treat peace as a reward for finishing everything instead of a choice in the middle of everything. But the truth, raw and radiant, is this: peace is not a destination. It is a decision. It is not found at the end of the to-do list, nor at the edge of a perfect day. It is right here, right now, in this breath, in this very heartbeat. And the only thing keeping us from it is the belief that we must wait. Letting go of someday is not giving up. It's waking up. It's realizing that your life is not in the next chapter, the next version of yourself, or the next miracle. It's in the ordinary, the spoon hitting the cup, the breeze brushing your cheek, the silence between thoughts. Buddhism teaches that clinging to a future moment is a form of suffering. We suffer not because the present is unbearable, but because we believe the future will save us. But have you noticed? Every time the future arrives, it just becomes another now. And if you weren't fully here before, you won't be fully there either. So what are we really waiting for? A Zen monk once said, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The tasks don't change, your presence does. When you stop resisting the now, you become intimate with life. You see the sacred in the mundane. You taste your tea instead of rushing through it. You look into someone's eyes and see them, not as a means to an end, but as a miracle of this moment. You understand, finally, that presence is not something you earn. It is your natural state. It's what remains when the noise of the mind quiets down, even for a second. And in that silence, you don't become peaceful. You remember that you already are. So how do you break the myth of someday? You do the radical. You breathe now. You pause. You stop trying to get anywhere. You give yourself permission to be here, even if things are unresolved, imperfect, undone. Even if you're grieving or growing or just tired. Because this moment, with all its cracks and colors, is still worthy of your attention, of your tenderness, of your presence. The practice is simple but never easy. Come back, again and again, to the breath, to the body, to the bird on the windowsill, to the laugh of your child, to the ache in your chest, to the now. You don't need more time, you need less escape. You don't need to do more, you need to be more here. You don't need a better life. You just need to show up for the one you already have. And the miracle is this: when you do, it's enough. Even in chaos, peace is possible. Even in sorrow, joy is not lost. Even in waiting, there is wonder if you stop waiting. Because peace is not what happens when life is perfect. It's what happens when you no longer need it to be. And that peace, it's not someday. It's always now. You've tried hard, you've strived, you've pushed. You've done everything the world said you should. And still, there's this subtle ache, a longing for something deeper, more real. What if the answer isn't in doing more, but in being more? Not in efforting toward transformation, but in surrendering to presence. This is where the truth of Buddhist wisdom glows most brightly. Not in complexity, not in perfection, but in the radical simplicity of this moment. Because here's what most people get wrong about transformation. They think it's a mountain to climb, a future version of themselves they must force into being. But transformation isn't a destination. It's what happens when resistance falls away, when we stop trying so hard to change, and instead allow truth to reveal itself through quiet presence. Let me tell you a story. A monk once asked the Buddha, "What must I do to attain enlightenment?" The Buddha replied, "Nothing, just be awake. No chasing, no fixing, no grasping, just wakefulness." But this is harder than it sounds, because we've been trained from birth to value striving. We're told that if we're not hustling, not progressing, we're failing. This conditioning becomes so deeply ingrained that even our spiritual journey becomes another project, another goal to conquer. And so we meditate with effort, we breathe with control, we read wisdom like it's a checklist, we seek silence but bring the noise of ambition with us. But the paradox is this: The more you try to be present, the less present you are. Why? Because presence isn't something you achieve, it's something you return to. Like a home you never really left. Like sunlight always waiting behind the clouds of your mind. And when you stop striving, something sacred arises. You begin to notice the warmth of breath in your chest, the weight of your feet against the earth, the subtle pause between heartbeats. Life stops feeling like a race and becomes something more ancient, more gentle, a song that sings itself, if you would only be still enough to listen. You don't need to effort your way into wholeness. You're not broken, you're distracted. That's the real illusion that you need fixing. That piece is somewhere out there. In the next job, the next partner, the next life phase. But the truth is, transformation begins not with striving, but with presence. True presence is a kind of spiritual relaxation. It's the moment you put down the weight of becoming and finally allow yourself to just be. This doesn't mean you stop taking action. It means your actions are rooted in awareness, not anxiety. It means you move, but not out of fear. You create, but not from lack. You speak, but not from the need to prove. You begin to live from the inside out, not in reaction to the world, but in communion with it. And that's where real transformation begins, not with another self-help technique, but with the courage to do less and be more. To stop trying to become someone, to start remembering who you already are. A quiet, luminous being, not defined by past or future, but alive, utterly alive right here, right now. So breathe, soften, feel, and let presence do what striving never could. And from this deep presence, a new chapter unfolds. You've walked through shadows and silence, through fears and freedoms, and now here we are. There's a story in Zen about a monk who asked the master, "What is the path to liberation?" The master simply opened his palm and let a leaf fall to the ground. No words, just the letting go. And in that single gesture lies the paradox that most people spend a lifetime resisting. The less you grip, the more you grow. Because growth, real, deep, soul-level transformation, doesn't come from striving. It comes from softening, from surrender, from the space you create when you stop trying to control, to fix, to chase, to prove. In the beginning, it feels like giving up, like you're losing ground, like you're becoming invisible. But over time, something unexpected blooms: peace, strength, presence. You become grounded not in doing, but in being. You stop measuring your life by outcomes and begin sensing it through aliveness. You start to notice how tightly you've been holding onto your past, your image, your fears, even your hopes, and you begin to open your hands. It's strange how empty hands can feel so full. You start to trust the river of life more than your oars. You stop swimming so hard upstream and let the current guide you, not because you're passive, but because you've grown wise enough to recognize when the fight is not the way. You choose alignment over resistance, simplicity over performance, and suddenly everything changes, not because life changed, but because you changed how you meet it. There is no more grasping for love because you realize love isn't something you earn, it's something you become. There is no more clinging to control because peace doesn't live in control, it lives in flow. And there is no more chasing meaning because the deepest meaning arises not from effort but from presence. Every moment becomes sacred when you no longer demand it to be different. This is the art of Zen living, not a life of detachment but a life of freedom. Not an escape from reality but a deeper intimacy with it. A life where you still feel, still care, still act, but without the weight of needing to possess, prove, or predict. Where your heart remains wide open but your hands are light. Where you love with all your being yet never cling. Where you walk through life rooted but never rigid. This is what the Buddha meant when he said, "Hold nothing back, cling to nothing. Be like the sky, vast, open, and free." So if you're still searching, still trying to fix what was never broken, still gripping the reins of a life that refuses to be tamed, pause, breathe, and let go. Let go of the need to know. Let go of the need to be more. Let go of the illusion that peace lives in the future. It doesn't. It never did. Peace is here, now, in the stillness between breaths, in the softness of surrender, in the gentle realization that everything you were chasing was already within you, waiting for you to stop running. So, open your hands, open your heart, and grow not by holding on, but by letting go.